Welcome to another episode of MMT Mondays. Tonight we're going to look at the 50th anniversary of President Nixon ending the Bretton Woods system and see how taking the United States off of the gold standard opened up a host of possibilities for the government to create a more equitable economy. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and let's get to it. Prior to 1971, the Bretton Woods International Monetary System established that the dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce, then all other national currencies were pegged to the dollar at fixed exchange rates. This system was put into place following World War II in 1946 until it fell apart in 1971.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. Invited by President Roosevelt to the first major world financial meeting since the London Conference of 1933, they will work in the seclusion of this White Mountains resort. Zhang Shi-kung, one of China's representatives, with Secretary and Mrs. Henry Morgenthau. United States Treasury Secretary Morgenthau heads the American delegation. On the opening day, in his role of acting conference president, he addresses the meeting. We discussed our plans for the stabilization of world currencies. All agreements must be ratified by the governing bodies of the nations involved before becoming effective. Delegates to this monetary and financial conference pose on the hotel lawn. These meetings are designed to promote trade in the post-war world and to create a foundation for lasting peace.
The reason it fell apart was because the supply of international dollars was growing faster than the supply of gold. The fundamental problem with the gold standard and any fixed exchange rate regime is that it limits the economy. The government might not be able to spend or lend because doing so would cause it to run out of gold. If the bank clears payments in gold, then they might not be able to lend to fulfill investment desires because they'd run out of gold. This is why whenever the government needs to jumpstart the economy and move the economy to full employment to fulfill some purpose like, win a war, they go off the gold standard. When countries started demanding payments in gold instead of dollars, Nixon chose to end convertibility into gold. This ended the Bretton Woods system and began the era of floating exchange rates, which we still use today.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
This was a monumental moment for the world because on a floating exchange rate, a government is capable of pursuing full employment through a job guarantee policy. Unfortunately, capability and possibility does not always ensure that something comes to fruition. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? So when the United States moved to a floating exchange rate, the potential was there to have radically altered who or whom the economy worked for. A floating exchange rate is a pillar of the modern monetary theory. The federal government's preference for floating exchange rates is about removing constraints on an economy that compromises its capacity to maintain full employment and price stability and ultimately deliver equitable outcomes to all. Unfortunately, rather than usher in an era that could have brought an equitable economy to the working class, the fact that we became a fiat currency with a floating exchange rate was used to bring in an era of neoliberalism that has culminated in the highest levels of inequality since the 1800s. In our next video, we see a 2017 interview featuring real progressives own Steve Grumbine talking to the father of MMT, Warren Mosler, about how the ultimate wasteful nature of the gold standard helped usher in the downfall of the Bretton Woods system.
He wrote a friggin' fantastic piece talking about the kind of like the history of the gold standard. And if it was such a wonderful thing, why does everybody keep leaving it? Yeah. And can you kind of just quickly state what the gold standard is, and what it is not, and kind of why it fails miserably everywhere it is, and then kind of explain why, this system that we have is perfect to satisfy a progressive agenda?
Well, I'd say the system we have can support a progressive agenda. I wouldn't say it's quite perfect, but it can support a progressive agenda a lot better than it's doing. It's got a few flaws in there. Okay, yes, look, anytime a country goes to war that's on the gold standard, they go off the gold standard because they're going to lose the war. Because it constrains what the government can spend. It constrains lending, it constrains banking. And it's it's a legislated constraint. It's not, and so instead of being constrained by available resources, you also are constrained by this legislation that requires taxes to be paid in gold, basically. So your tax credits become gold certificates. The government has, if taxes due, it can only be paid in gold. And when the relative value of gold changes, the system, everything else changes violently to try and keep up with it, up or down. And if there's a shortage of funds needed to pay taxes for whatever reason, maybe there's been a big default or a loss or a big banking loss or something, yes, in theory, everything will deflate. The only jobs people will be able to get is gold miners. Everybody will be out scouring the mines and the streets for gold and beg, borrowing, and steal to try and get enough gold. And so, yeah, you'll have full employment because you've got half your economy out looking for gold rather than fighting the war and growing the food and everything else. So, and if you're building gold reserves, which we did under the gold standard, right? Because gold becomes the object of savings. The only way you can save is to have more gold because the only dollars you have are based on the amount of gold in the Federal Reserve. And so you get this human endeavor is directed towards accumulating gold. So you've got, millions of people digging these huge holes in the ground, digging up tons and tons of ore, spending huge amounts of energy, to then melt it down and via, the most toxic chemicals you can imagine trying to leach it out of the gold. And, millions of people building all the heavy equipment and tires 8 feet tall to try and drive the machines to all this stuff around. If you look at all the stuff that supports gold mining, okay, then finally you get it melted down, you get into these gold ingots. Then it gets shipped to the United States, let's say, and over in the United States in Kentucky, in Fort Knox, we go out and go through this huge human endeavor, digging these big hole in the ground for a vault, building Fort Knox, and then we take the money, we take the gold that came out of one hole in the ground, and went through all this transformation to put it in another hole in the ground in Fort Knox and leave it there so that, that becomes our national savings. And then we have to post guards and have all kinds of security around it to make sure some foreign entity doesn't come and take, the gold out of our hole in the ground and put it in their hole in the ground. Like the whole, my friend Steve Sanciola from college used to just go on and on about this stupidity, what everybody's doing with this gold. And, what's the point? To constrain monetary savings, to constrain being able to save the tax credit needed, to pay your tax liabilities, to only be, so much so that it's equal to the amount of gold in this hole in the ground in Kentucky. Like, what is the further public purpose behind that? What is gained by taking these real labor hours, these real resources, goods and service, committing them to this endeavor rather than something else? All those people could have taken the day off and played golf or something. Like, why not? So we wouldn't have had the gold. So what? We don't do anything with it except what I just talked about.
When you hear Mosler lay out the sheer wasteful nature of the gold standard, it sounds pretty crazy, doesn't it? We will see in next week's episode that while the shift towards a floating exchange rate lifted the fiscal constraints that the gold standard placed on our economy, it has ultimately failed to harness the monumental potential. Why have those in power used it for nefarious purposes such as war and MMT for the rich, while causing the working class to suffer under genocidal austerity politics? By unpegging our currency from gold, we removed the constraints that prevented us from being able to afford all of the programs like Medicare for All, a federal job guarantee, and a Green New Deal that we desperately need. Next week, we will answer why this was allowed to happen, while also discussing how we can stand together to demand policies that will allow the working class to thrive instead of just survive. If you enjoyed tonight's video, make sure to check us out at realprogressives.org and subscribe to get notifications on new video streams in YouTube, Periscope, Twitch, Facebook, and Rockfilm. Thank y'all, and have a great one.